Hello, my sophomores, and welcome to the first installment of 20th Century 2 Week in Review. What a fantastic week it was. Let's take a look at all the things that happened. We won the war, but found ourselves poised to annihilate each other at what would be the most scariest of world wars that we could possibly create. But instead, things kind of simmered down into what we would call a Cold War. That would be a war without armies fighting each other, but yet two sides fighting each other using economies and using propaganda to win the hearts and minds of millions of Europeans who are still shaken by war and devastated, homeless, and hungry. And it was up to the United States to rise to the challenge, and it was up to the Soviet Union to hold on to territory and potentially expand its communist influence in Europe. So at the beginning of the week, we asked the question, well, who started the whole thing? And we had primary documents that we looked at from President Truman himself, and then former Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The Churchill document, of course, was the infamous Iron Curtain speech, where we learned that the Iron Curtain really isn't a curtain, nor is it made of iron, but it's made of barbed wire. And it's a boundary that separates Eastern Europe under communist control and Western Europe under democratic capitalist American control. For all, in part, really, under American control. The Churchill speech talks about the free wills of people being oppressed on the other side and the importance of making certain that we do what we can to lift that curtain. I don't even remember what it was about. So, of course, the importance is the concept of the Iron Curtain. Being able to identify it on a map and understanding the sides that it divides. It also demonstrates the idea of propaganda and language. How is the West going to frame its narrative as it starts this Cold War against Soviet Union? And then the other document we saw was Truman's Truman Doctrine speech, where we begin to examine what is the Truman Doctrine. We haven't really fully wrapped our heads around it yet, but we're starting to put things into place. And one is it deals with financial aid and building aid, providing today what would have been probably $1 trillion worth of material and food and loans to the free countries of Europe in an effort to A, rebuild Europe, but also B, for lack of a better term, isn't it a bribe? So, stay democratic and stay free, and we're going to give you a lot of really cool free stuff. What's that first example of free stuff? That first shot, if you will, that's fired in this Cold War? A war with no battles, no monuments. That's my best Sean Connery doing a best Russian captain, because Sean Connery really doesn't act. He just is Sean Connery in various roles, right? Listen to him speak Japanese in Rising Sun at some point, and you'll know what I'm talking about. Well, the first shot in the Cold War is the Berlin AIrlift, when the Russians closed the borders to West Berlin, which is, of course, snuggled right in the middle of all of communist East Germany, a nice little chewy chocolate center of democracy and an otherwise controlled economy. And the Russians wanted us out. So they closed the borders and figured they could starve us out and freeze us out, because when they closed the border, it was nice and sunny, but winter is always coming. So we spent the second half of the week looking at the Berlin AIrlift and the reasons behind the blockade and why the Soviets probably were going to regret it based on that CIA spy document that we had, which was very cool. And finally, looking at how the United States and Great Britain stepped up. And they said, you know what, we're not really certain if we can do it, but we're going to try it anyway. And we're going to fly food and fuel into Berlin. And for the better part of 10 months, in both beautiful and nasty weather, American pilots flew food into Berlin. And after 10 months, the Soviets relented. It was clear that the Americans were going to be able to do it, and that we had already scored the political victory. We were not going to be pushed out of Berlin. If you were to walk away as an American citizen from these two events, you need to know the Iron Curtain concept. I mean, even more than the Truman Doctrine. And I find that people just don't know the Truman Doctrine, and that's fine. But everybody just seems to know the Iron Curtain. They remember the Iron Curtain. And I would say that if 10 years from now, if you were going to remember something, you would remember that Churchill is the one that coined that phrase. And it really did put a really strong metaphorical stamp on what was going on and how the West was going to frame the narrative against the East. And then the other thing that you would want to remember is Gail Heverston, who is the chocolate bomber. He's the guy who started bombing, if you will, German children with Hershey's bars, which, you know, for all the political propaganda, and we saw some of it, right, from both the East and the West in Berlin, for all the propaganda, sometimes the most powerful thing that you can do is something for children that's good. And you can score points on an impromptu moment where you're like, hey, you know what? Let's do something special for these kids. And then the next thing you know, you're the most important thing out of a historical era. And the chocolate bomber's in every single textbook I've seen. You can't do anything about whether it's a documentary or a website. You can't do anything without talking about him and what he did. So if we were going to walk forward to today and say, how am I going to make a difference? How am I going to do something that's going to be beneficial for people? Sometimes it's a small gesture, and sometimes it's for children who are in need. And it's easy to do, and it turns out to be disproportionately powerful and meaningful, and you stand a better chance of being remembered for having done something incredibly important. So, hopefully you were here this week for all of that. If you were absent and need some of those documents, you know where to go to find me to get caught up on that. Next week we're going to look at the evolution of the Cold War. We're going to see the closing of the borders in Berlin. We're going to see spreading to other parts of the world and how the United States will deal with it. We'll get a complete idea of the Truman Doctrine and check out America's level of commitment to preventing the spread of communism around the world. So, hope this was helpful for you. Insert catchy log-off sentence here, and we'll see you next time.